The Horn of Africa faces its fifth consecutive failed rainy season. That is according to the head of the World Meteorological Organization. He says it pushes Kenya, Ethiopia and Somalia to the brink of an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. That dire warning is likely to cause considerable concern at the next Global Climate Summit, COP27, which will be held on the African continent in Egypt in November. Well, ahead of that, government officials, activists and charity workers are meeting this week in the West African country of Gabon to discuss the challenges of climate change. The World Meteorological Organization predicts that climate change could expose up to 118 million of the continent's poorest people to droughts, floods and extreme heat by 2030. The UN says Africa's already experienced widespread damage due to climate events, but it also suggests that the continent could offer many potential solutions to what it calls the worst environmental crisis the world is faced with. Let's hear now from South Africa. Thando Lukuko is the coordinator of the South African Climate Action Network, joins us now from Cape Town. Africa seems to be suffering disproportionately when you look at what its emissions are. What are the main priorities for this conference over the next few days?
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for having me on your show. Sure, Africa does face the worst of climate change. For us, what's a priority are three key issues. Number one is loss and damage, specifically loss and damage finance. Number two is climate finance, and then number three is the just transition. So quickly, just to expand on all three. So the loss and damage speaks to the kinds of scenarios we're seeing happening in countries like India and Pakistan with the flooding. There was a question that your previous guest asked about, how does the state then finance rebuilding of an entire city that's gone underwater, right? And of course, the fiscus can only go so far. So the idea of a loss and damage fund would enable a government like that of Pakistan to tap into some resources from the international community that could help it rebuild. This then speaks to the second issue, which is climate finance. And this one could be split into two subjects, so adaptation and mitigation. On the adaptation front, we're speaking on once these communities need to now recover and get back to normal life, if you will, how can we build it back in such a manner that homesteads, cities, towns that have been destroyed are now built back in such a manner that allows for them to easily be resilient to a changed environment? And so adaptation seeks to address that particular question. Of course, the issue of finance always plays a role. With adaptation specifically, it hasn't received the equivalent or parity funding as mitigation has.
Okay, can I just stop you? You've got some amazing stats there, but just on the funding, for example, I think sure. Africa, 48 African countries were looking for $1.2 trillion in commitments from the West and developed nations. How much of that money has actually come through?
Not that great deal. So in the last year, what we've seen is that 13 billion in climate finance between 2020 and 2021 was issued out. Only 4 billion of that went to 46 sub-Saharan African countries. So that's a tiny percent as compared to what is needed. And of course, we know that the continent is going to face the greatest impacts of climate change, including small island states. So this is really what we're trying to push for, including how then, when we rebuild back, how do you provide energy for almost 1 billion people in a continent that hasn't had quite as much pollution or polluting sectors as we have in the West, for instance.
Yeah, and so, just on the specific issue of the drought, the lack of water, the forced migration, people being displaced in their own countries. I mean, this is a looming disaster potentially, isn't it? And could happen quite quickly. In fact, in some countries, it already has, hasn't it? I'm thinking about Angola and Namibia.
Precisely, Tim, and this is the reason why I think one of the things that can't be called for enough is political leadership, political will. We know, for instance, we saw with COVID-19 just how quickly resources were mobilized in the face of such an extreme threat. I think climate change probably causes a greater threat than COVID, just that the impacts of it aren't seen as immediately as COVID, for instance. But again, Pakistan shows us differently. And so right now, more than ever, we need governments and heads of states to realize that, particularly for the global south, including Africa, more funds are needed to be channeled to these countries in order to help them rebuild once extreme damages have happened.
All right.
And there's no amount of money existing now that could be done. We just need to be able to find the money in the same way that we did for COVID-19 to be able to rebuild.
Thando Lukuko, I'm sorry to cut you short, but thanks very much indeed for joining us here on BBC World News.